And then we get interesting areas of what happens when you retire and you can't sell your practice and no one takes your records over. What happens then? The dental board's had a lot of fun with that over the last 5 or 10 years as well. So look, that's basically records. A lot of it is common sense, but if you take nothing else away, yes.
In this rapidly changing era of digital storage, what happens if you store your records on a format that is no longer technologically readable?
Well, I guess there's not too much you can do about that. However, it would be, I would imagine that a common sense approach would be it'd be judged in the format. So if you've got everything on 5.25-inch floppies, does anyone know what those are? Well, you probably need to put them over onto something else. And just, because you can still do that, you can still get 5.25 floppies, I think, readers, can't you? You'll get CDs. Well, you can't do much about that. I mean, it is what it is. But these days, as technology moves forward, you tend to bring those in. However, again, this is one of those, there's no answer for that, except for do the best you can. If you've got a whole bunch of that stuff and it's past the age of majority and you think most of the patients are dead, then I probably wouldn't lose too much sleep over it. It'd be great to go to the dental board with a box of floppies and say, have a crack at this. Could have made a really good joke out of that, but I'm just kind of glad I didn't. Did I see another hand up there just to stop me talking for a while? No? Okay. So privacy and confidentiality is kind of related to what we just talked about. And there is a right to privacy unless you allow someone access. It's necessary for administrative or legal means. Public policy and some common misconceptions are that in relation to privacy is really what we talked about with records, that people have access to those records. If you want to look at the guidelines, you can go into legislation. It's quite straightforward. You have to give them to them within a reasonable time. What does reasonable time mean? That's the lawyer word. What does reasonable mean? Well, probably a year is not reasonable. The next day is probably in excess of reasonable. It's really a matter of personal judgment. And a lot of these things are only tested when they get to court, which mostly they don't very often. So let's talk about something that really doesn't matter anymore to some extent, and that is negligence as we understood it. So when I was at dental school many years ago, we had a lecture or 3 lectures about, and it was all about negligence really, you know. And does anyone know what negligence is? I guess most people have an understanding of it. I'll give you a very quick rundown on why a lot of it doesn't matter, because the health regulation process has sort of, to some extent, subsumed that area of law, because a lot of these issues, what used to happen when you were found negligent is that someone had to be aware that you had a problem, go to a lawyer, get it tested in court, go to a tribunal. You don't have to go through all that anymore. You just go to the HQCC and APRA, and solicitors actually use these agencies as testing grounds for the negligence cases, because they can just go and find out, and if they get an adverse finding in one of these arenas, then they can say, well, we've probably got something here, because lawyers are basically lazy. I mean, like we all are to some extent. So a lot of the stuff that we worry about, and Paul will tell you that the number of successful negligence claims against dentists is insignificant compared to what it might have believed to have been. A lot of that is because of PIPA, which is the sort of international move towards reducing the ease with which people can be sued. There's a really good movie on this which I saw not long ago called Hot Coffee. Has anyone heard of it? Hot Coffee? No? Does anyone want to tell you about it? It's really interesting. It's about the woman in America who drove through McDonald's and got really badly burnt. And the story that you would hear from the media was, and it's a plaintiff lawyer kind of movie, that, you know, this was just a woman who drove through McDonald's, but what it didn't tell you is the reality was how severe the burns were and the circumstances under which it happened. So this is a movie against tort reform, because some people really are terribly damaged and hurt by things that they have no recourse otherwise. So if you think about it, and I know none of you will, but Hot Coffee it's called, it's worth watching. So negligence is a tort, which is French for a wrong. It's got a few elements. You've got to have a duty, you've got to have a breach of that duty, and then damages flow from that. And unless the damages arise from the breach of the duty, then you can't get awarded any costs or damages. So causation is very important in negligence. And PIPA, as we talked about, I don't think enough P's in there, no, that's right, really reduced the cost of insurance and made it much harder for people just to go to court and have a crack all the time. So if you were in personal injuries law, you don't go to court very often. You spend a lot of time in mediation, as Paul's already mentioned. It's not only encouraged, it's mandated. So actually the whole legal system is encouraged to be, what do we used to call it in the old days? alternative dispute resolution, simply because if you go to court, it's going to cost you $3,000 or $5,000 for a barrister and another $3,000 for your solicitor per side, per day. So if you lose, it gets really expensive. I think you can understand those numbers pretty quickly. So that's why we have this, and it's kind of a good thing to a large extent. Certainly professional insurers think so. I'm not going to go through this. That's just professionalism, which is something that you probably already know about. I wrote an article last month which someone might have read or may not have. If you do, the students particularly here, if you're involved in radiology, it's a good concept on what you should do when you're taking radiographs and what you should advert to with patients. I'm not going to bore you to tears because it's in the Australian Dental Journal, which means no one will ever read it anyway. I was going to talk to you I think that's really most of what I want to say, but what I might show you is a complaint that I received just to bring it all together, and then I'll let Paul finish off. Any questions while I'm stopping and looking for a file? No? It will load soon. Right, so basically I worked as a dentist full-time until essentially 2007, and I went to UQ, Clinical Operations Manager there for 2 years, so I haven't really worked full-time as a dentist since 2009. So I used to be one of those people that would go to these evenings and say I've never been sued before and no one's ever made a complaint against me in 30-something years of practice, but that all came to a crashing end on the 2nd of April 2012. I've blacked out the patient's name here clearly, and anything else that could possibly allow you to guess who the person is, because that would be not a good thing. So basically this is what happens with a complaint. So you get a letter typically, and it looks like this. Mr. Brad, right? They don't like referring to dentists as doctor, but just don't get upset about that. Just nothing personal. That's just, they do that. Case number blah blah blah, complaint from when you were working at Shannon Lawrence Dental Centre in May 2004, and I went, WTF, that's an acronym that you can use if you understand. 2004, I mean that's like 8 years ago, well literally 8 years ago. So I went through it, and basically I'll get to the significant parts, but a lady had come to see me in 2004 and had a root canal treatment done. I admit I'm not the best endodontist in the world, but it was okay, and you'll see the radiographs if you're lucky shortly. So they said she'd complained. So I was curious as to why it took 8 years to complain about something I did in 2004, and this is a good example of what Paul's talking about, is that the legislation, a statute of limitations, as many of you understand it, is some absolute. I can tell you it's not. Statute of limitations gets waived by courts all the time if they believe it's in the public interest and public benefit to do it. This was really not a matter of that. This lady had claimed that she had been to see me, I'd done a root canal treatment, and then some years later she'd realised what the reason that it had never worked was, and more of that soon. So that's what a complaint letter looks like. It goes on for some pages, and then it has a whole bunch of other stuff here where the person fills it in, and you see your name in lights down here. As I go, can't you? Yeah, Brad performed root canal treatment, not Dr. Wright, just Brad performed root canal treatment. That's fine, I don't mind. My patients always call me by my first name. And I'd left a heat rod in the tooth. I don't know what a heat rod was, but apparently I'd left one in there. So then this goes on to say, you know, I owe this much and this much and this much and all of that stuff, which is what people do. I noticed that she'd be referred by a lawyer, which always cheers me up. And then she wrote another letter and said that she'd moved, and this is what had happened. So basically, I'd done the root canal treatment, and you'll see the records shortly. She had trouble with it soon after, and there's a series of correspondence about that. Then she moved away, which is what happens all the time. And she went to another dentist 8 years later and said, this tooth is hurting me, I'm sick of it, can you remove it? He did. The dentist removed it, had a look at it, and said, oh, I know why you've had troubles with it. The dentist left heat rods in it. This is legitimately what it says. I'm not making this up. So I spent a lot of time blacking this out. So I thought, well, I don't know what a heat rod is, but I'm presuming that a heat rod is, what would you call it, a thermal plugger. I don't even use the system anymore, but what do you used to call those things that you plug GP with? You heat them up in the canal. Sorry? Yeah, well, thermophil's what I was using, but, a heat rod, I think what they were referring to was the thing that used to push the GP down in the old days, and it's still a carry, yeah, spreader. Thank you. Right. That's how long I've been out of it. But I haven't used one of those since 1998 because I got onto using thermophil because I'm not an endodontist, but it worked for me, and I know I'm not the only person. Hopefully someone else in the audience has said they've used thermophil. Good. So these are my records. Now, why I'm showing you these records is I had nothing to do with these records. I did not put one thing into this record. I had a particularly good dental assistant at the time who was well trained by me, and she was very good, and this is what she put into the record. So all of this, which is reverse chronological order, which is a real pain, but if we go all the way down to the beginning, we go down where we find out that here's the patient comes, another dentist had seen her, wasn't happy with the other dentist, it was a previous infected tooth, came to see me. Long story short, she had some trouble on the way. I've written it, I've used, if you look at that particular area there in the middle of the screen, endo initial 4-6 RCT, 2 scan S, 1 Zylocane, the canal, patient was still uncomfortable, that canal's there, that canal's there, that canal's there, Wilton saline, flushed out infection. You can see the detail there. Am I going to write this in at 6 o'clock at night at the end of the day? Well, maybe you are, and you're special if you can, but I'm not. And this is why contemporaneous note-taking by a dental assistant who understands being well-trained is so critical, because that's what made the difference here. So, okay, I would have liked a few capitals in there for the name of the material reader, but I'm not going to be picky. 1 radiogram taken. Then we have the follow-up, and I'm big for saying to people, telephone your patients after every procedure you do by giving them an anaesthetic, a local anaesthetic. So I don't care if it's an extraction or a small restoration, you should call them up and ask them how they're doing. So that's our standard procedure. Obturation there, all the way up here, and then we get into the post-operative calls where there's some sensitivity. We talked about whether it was that tooth or not because it was sensitive to cold. And finally, we get to the point that this lady says in February 2005, I spoke to X, sensitive settled down really well, thanks, it's the best it's ever been. End of story as far as I was concerned until 8 years later. So what's happened is, and here's my submission, because of what I do for a living now, this is what my submission looks like. They asked for it, they got it, 44 points or something. But the point was that this dentist had gone, and there's a couple of lessons here, this dentist had gone, removed this tooth, presumably split, and had seen the thermophil placed in the middle of the canal and seen little black carriers which go in the middle of the thermophil. And to my knowledge, there's no way of removing those black carriers under current technology. You leave them in there because that's just what you do. He apparently was not familiar with thermophil and made a comment like that I know why this failed because he left the heat rods in there. So as a result of that, I get a HQCC complaint 8 years later for something that I believe I didn't do wrong. Now, I didn't appreciate it very much because it took me a lot of time, and I do this for a living, to respond to that in an appropriate manner. So I can imagine how much someone like you must like doing this sort of stuff, because it's not a nice feeling. The point I'd make is, and it's one that relates to professionalism, and that is that if you see something that someone else has done, even if it is 8 years ago and it's someone you don't even like, just be very careful what you say in front of a patient, because if my notes weren't very good or something else wasn't right, I could have been in line up for that. And I'd really, to my knowledge, done nothing wrong. Now, I got a letter from HQCC 2 days ago, which I shared with Paul, because as soon as I got the letter, I do what everyone should do, and that is you contact ADAQ. I mean, I'm big and ugly enough to look after myself, but I'm still going to go to my insurer. So I've got a complaint. I'm dealing with it this way. Do you have any other feedback on my submissions, which Paul and I went through? And that's what you do. So whether you're big and ugly enough to look after yourself like I am, or whether you're new to practice, you do the same thing. That's contact ADAQ. Tell them what's going on and keep them up to date with all correspondence, which is what I did. So I got a letter back the other day saying this had been referred to an external clinical advisor who'd had a look at it and agreed with me, and my submission was in the end that the person who should be giving an apology was the other dentist for not understanding what thermophil was. It's not my fault. So it's not handed happily yet because the dental board will occasionally get to stick to, have to approve that I've done nothing wrong, but God willing, that'll be the end of the story. So no matter how long you practice for and no matter how well you do, you can still have a complaint against you, and having a complaint against you doesn't mean you're an evil or a bad person. It just means that governments and organisations, for good reasons, after, you may have heard of something about something called Patel down a place called Bundaberg down the road a few years ago. Because of those things, governments are very sensitive, and so they have to investigate. And if you make it easy to investigate and you encourage people to complain, you are going to get a complaint. So that's the end of what I had to say. So I'll let Paul finish off there. Is there any questions about that? No? I'll find out how to do it while Paul talks. That's right. I'm sorry. I'm a Keynote user. I don't use PowerPoint much.
How are we going? Is everybody still with us on the home stretch? Thank you very much, Brad. And if I could just summarise it, that's the key. Good records, good defence. Poor records, pretty poor defence. No records, you're gone. And this, of course, is a good reason for having no records. Look, I just want to highlight a couple of other things. Now that you've seen one example, this is a medical history form. It was about the size of an A5 piece of paper and pretty scruffy looking. It looks like it's but that's how it was actually printed. But you can see the patient in this case, where the big red arrow is pointing, has not indicated any particular issues which would require antibiotics before an extraction. Apart from the fact she thought she was allergic to penicillin. Now, allergies to penicillin are a bit iffy. If you ask Geraldine Moses, who's our ADAQ consultant, she says a lot of people mistake what they believe is an allergy for, I don't particularly like that, or I was sick when I was a child, my mum told me it must have been so-and-so. But there you go. So this lady marked nothing on a medical history form which was out of the ordinary. This was her treatment card. Lots of explanations in there, as you can see. Unfortunately, this lady died 36 hours after this treatment. And it came up about 6 months later during a coronial inquest, and the dentist received a rather obtuse letter, shall we say, from the legal team saying, please explain, we want your records, etc. He couldn't recall the patient. Now, that would not be unusual. One visit from a patient some months beforehand, could not remember it at all. So, how did he fare? Well, the reality is this thing saved his life, basically. There was no indication that this patient needed antibiotics. She died in hospital from some sort of complication. I don't recall the circumstances. In fact, it was never really explained to me. But certainly a death within the last 48 hours. She'd seen a dental practitioner. You can imagine what was said. Bacterial endocarditis, etc., etc. So that's the way it worked, and it was quite ugly and quite upsetting for the dentist involved. But a good set of records would have been more helpful. There you go, explanations and so on, but in this case, at least dead people can't argue they weren't told things. But certainly the medical history form was critical. The issue of signing consent forms. This whole form has been around for some time, and as Brad has been pointing out, signing a consent form is helpful, but it doesn't necessarily mean the patient understood what was happening. In this particular case, this was the X-ray taken by a dentist. It was over a patient who came in with some pretty severe pain from a wisdom tooth, and it had been ongoing.